His lawyer leaned in and whispered 5 words. Just 5. And Michael's face, that smug, self-satisfied face I'd stared at across the breakfast table for 15 years, went completely white. His hands started trembling. The papers he'd been so eager to sign were shaking like leaves in a storm. And me, for the first time in 3 years, I smiled. I wasn't just happy. I was vindicated. This wasn't a divorce anymore. It was an audit. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The gala for Mercer Hospitality was supposed to be a celebration of 15 years of marriage and growth. Instead, it was the funeral for my patience. Michael stood on that stage under the crystal chandeliers of the Dallas ballroom, glowing with the arrogance that only $3,200,000 in assets can buy. Or so he thought. He thanked his mentors, his vision, and his unwavering drive. He looked at me in the front row and gave a perfunctory nod, the kind you give a reliable employee you're planning to lay off. He never thanked the architect who had actually designed every lobby and negotiated every vendor contract while he was out playing the part of the Titan. When we returned to our estate, the silence was clinical. He didn't even wait to take off his tuxedo. He sat at the kitchen table, the one I had picked out specifically because it was large enough for family dinners that he was always too busy to attend. He looked at me with eyes that had already calculated my replacement value. "I want a divorce, Rachel," he said. His voice was flat, like he was reading a corporate press release. "And let's be realistic. I built this empire. I'm keeping the house, the cars, and the business. Everything. You can keep Jacob. He's always been more your project anyway." He said it with a shrug. Like my 15-year-old son was a leftover pizza, he was graciously letting me finish. Michael was ordering off a menu of his own greed. Assets, yes. Responsibilities, hold the child. I didn't break. I didn't let a single tear touch the expensive marble of our countertops. Despair is a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. I just stared at the man I had spent half my life building and realized our marriage hadn't been a union. It had been a subscription, and I was finally ready to stop footing the bill. "You want me to give it all to you?" I asked. My voice was as cold as the ice in his glass. "Every bit," he snapped. "I have the expensive lawyers. I have the leverage. Don't make this difficult, Rachel. It's better for everyone if you just walk away clean." He thought clean meant empty-handed. He didn't realize my version of clean meant leaving him with the dirt he'd spent 3 years burying. He smiled, that predatory, arrogant grin that assumed I was too broken to fight. He thought he was winning because he had the title of Chief Executive Officer. I let him have the title. I was busy looking at the ledger. As soon as his footsteps faded toward the guest wing, I didn't go to bed. I went to my office. I didn't call a friend to cry. I didn't call my mother for comfort. I reached into the back of my desk and pulled out a nondescript black folder. Inside were 3 years of methodical, quiet tracking. $3,800,000. That wasn't our net worth. That was the sum of the secret loans, the failed cryptocurrency gambles, and the high-interest lines of credit he had opened to keep his hollow empire from collapsing while he bought Madison jewelry. Michael thought he was discarding a wife to keep a fortune. He didn't know he was demanding a mountain of debt, and I was going to hand him the shovel. This wasn't a breakdown. It was accounting. And for the first time in 15 years, I was the one who held the pen. For 15 years, I wasn't just Michael's wife. I was his ghostwriter. Every sleek line of the hospitality empire he bragged about at those high-society Dallas galas was born in my mind, not his. I was the head architect who designed every lobby and negotiated every vendor contract, while he simply showed up to cut the ribbon and collect the applause. I had been the silent investor in his version of a family, but my investment was paid in sweat and stolen recognition. Michael received the awards and the accolades, while I received the task of making sure the household ran smoothly, and our son was raised in a home that felt stable. The truth about our thriving life came to light on a Tuesday night exactly 3 years ago. While Michael was out late at another essential networking event, I sat in my office reconciling the company ledgers. I didn't find profit. I found a trail of calculated ruin. Michael had been taking high-interest loans against every asset we supposedly owned. I traced transfers to accounts I didn't recognize and realized he had lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in reckless cryptocurrency gambles. Worse, I saw the thousands flowing toward Madison Sawyer for an apartment and jewelry I was never meant to know about. He hadn't been building an empire. He had been building a house of cards that stood $3,800,000 in the hole. People will eventually ask why I didn't leave the second I saw the numbers. They don't understand the invisible chains of a survivor. My silence for those 3 long years wasn't born of weakness or camouflaged despair. It was a strategic choice. I was living in a prison without bars, a psychological cage, where the only way to ensure my son's future was to stay until I had enough evidence to lock the cell door from the outside. My compassion had been a luxury my family had overdrafted for a decade, and I was done allowing them to use my kindness as their credit line. I stayed to ensure that when the crash happened, Michael would be the only one caught under the rubble. I didn't cry when I saw the bank statements. I didn't ask him for an explanation. I simply opened a new encrypted file and started documenting every lie, every loan, and every betrayal. Every morning I made his coffee was another entry on the balance sheet. Every perfunctory nod he gave me in public was another reason to ensure his legal ruin was total. I realized then that our marriage was no longer a contract of love. It was an audit of his character, and he was failing every single category. I was no longer his wife. I was the auditor of his downfall. Michael didn't wait for the ink to dry on his demands before the invasion began. Madison Sawyer didn't just walk into my house. She colonized it. She showed up with 3 designer suitcases and the arrogance of someone who thought she'd won the lottery. She was wearing my cashmere coat, the one Michael bought me for our 10th anniversary. She didn't even have the decency to hide the theft. To her, I was already a ghost, and she was the new tenant of my life. She walked into my kitchen, the heart of the home I had meticulously designed, and looked at the walls with a smirk. I had spent 3 weeks finding the perfect shade of sage green for that kitchen. It was a color that represented growth and the stability I thought we had. By Tuesday afternoon, that hope was covered in a flat, builder-grade gray. It was cheap, soulless, and exactly like Madison. She claimed the gray was sophisticated, but it turned the brightest room in the house into something that looked like a high-end prison cell. She even wore my grandmother's apron while she made smoothies in my blender, acting like she had spent 15 years building this life instead of just 15 minutes destroying it. The escalation followed the exact pattern of a calculated betrayal. My mother-in-law, Sarah, arrived shortly after the painters finished. She didn't come to see her grandson, Jacob, or to offer a kind word. She came to oversee the disposal of what she considered the obsolete model. Sarah didn't bring packing boxes. She brought a roll of heavy-duty black trash bags, like I was literal garbage being taken to the curb. "Michael needs a fresh start, Rachel," she said, her voice dripping with practiced, high-society condescension. She stuffed my silk blouses into the bags with a clinical efficiency. She went through my belongings and decided what I was graciously allowed to keep. My old work clothes were fine. A few family photos were permitted. She hesitated over my grandmother's recipe box, her fingers tracing the wood like she wanted to claim that, too. But eventually, she shoved it toward me. Everything of actual value, the furniture I had curated, the jewelry Michael had bought me, was labeled a marital asset. According to Sarah, Michael was entitled to keep the beauty I had created while I was entitled to the black bags. The final blow came that evening. Michael stood in the center of the now gray kitchen, looking at me like I was a budget line he was finally ready to cut. He handed me a single sheet of paper. It was a confirmation that my personal credit card and our joint accounts had been canceled. I had $0 of accessible credit. "You have 24 hours to take those bags and leave," Michael said. He didn't look at Jacob, who was standing in the hallway watching his world be stuffed into plastic. "I have a locksmith scheduled for noon tomorrow. I've been fair, Rachel, but you need to be realistic. This isn't your place anymore." I didn't argue. I didn't beg for a week to find an apartment or for money to feed our son. My silence wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. Michael thought he was winning because he had the house and the girl in the cashmere coat. He didn't realize that by evicting me, He was removing the only person who had been keeping the creditors at bay. He was demanding a $3,800,000 mountain of debt, and he was doing it with a smile. I picked up the recipe box and my son's hand. We weren't being thrown out. We were being released from a sinking ship. This wasn't a tragedy. It was the final clearance of a bad investment. I met Elizabeth in a glass-walled office that overlooked the Dallas skyline. She was 55, wore suits that cost more than a mid-sized luxury sedan, and had eyes that could spot a lie in a 300-page contract from across the room. She was a legal assassin who specialized in high-stakes financial warfare. I didn't need a shoulder to cry on. I needed a professional who could turn a mountain of debt into a clean slate. I walked into the final mediation session looking like a woman who had finally been ground into dust. I wore no makeup. I let the dark circles under my eyes show. I made sure my hands shook just enough when I reached for my glass of water. I was playing the gracious loser, a role I had been practicing for 15 years while standing in Michael's shadow. To the room, I looked defeated. Inside, my mind was a balance sheet, and I was about to move the decimal point on Michael's life. Michael sat across from me, already wearing his victory like a new suit. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and irritation, the way one looks at a broken appliance that is finally being hauled away. To him, I was just a lingering obstacle in the way of his new life and the unlimited success he thought Madison would help him achieve. He wanted the keys to the kingdom, and he wanted them before the afternoon sun hit the horizon. I spoke in a voice that was barely a whisper, thick with artificial despair. I just want it to be over, Michael. For Jacob's sake. I can't fight you anymore. You have the empire. You have the power. I'm tired. Elizabeth played her part with surgical precision. She looked at Michael's lawyer and sighed, a sound of professional surrender. My client is willing to relinquish all claims to the hospitality group, the Dallas estate, and the entire vehicle fleet. In exchange, she will accept a one-time cash settlement of $100,000 and her personal effects. $100,000. Michael practically laughed. To a man who believed he was sitting on a $3,200,000 empire, that amount was a pittance. It was a tip. He leaned back, his smugness filling the room like a physical weight. But there is one condition, Elizabeth added, sliding a document across the table. To ensure this is settled today without further delay, we require a mutual waiver of a full independent financial audit. My client doesn't want to spend months digging through books. She wants to take the settlement and disappear. Michael's lawyer hesitated. He leaned in and whispered to Michael about due diligence and the risks of assuming assets without a fresh valuation. But Michael wasn't listening to legal caution. He was listening to the ticking clock of his own ego. He wanted the house cleared of my presence, so he could publicize his new life. He saw the waiver as a shortcut to his throne. Sign it, Michael told his lawyer. I built that company. I know what's in those books better than any accountant ever will. We aren't wasting 30 days on an audit just so Rachel can feel important. I looked down at my lap to hide the flash of clarity in my eyes. This was the moment Michael signed his own death warrant. He picked up the pen with a flourish, his hand steady and arrogant. He signed for the hospitality group. He signed for the Dallas estate. He signed for the vehicle leases. And by doing so, he legally and voluntarily assumed every single cent of the $3,800,000 in hidden debt I had been tracking for 3 years. He handed the papers back to Elizabeth with a sharp, bright smile. There you go, Rachel. You got your $100,000. I suggest you spend it wisely because you're officially out of my budget. I took a deep breath, letting the shaky persona evaporate as I stood up. Thank you, Michael, I said. I wasn't thanking him for the money. I was thanking him for taking the shovel I'd handed him and digging his own financial grave. I walked out of that room $100,000 richer in cash and nearly $4 million lighter in liability. This wasn't a tragedy. It was the greatest clearance of bad debt in Dallas history. Elizabeth dropped the file on her mahogany desk. It landed with a sound that signaled the end of a legacy. She didn't look like she was delivering news of a broken heart. She looked like she was finalizing a hostile takeover. Rachel, "Your husband didn't just replace you with a younger model," she said, her voice like cut glass. "He replaced you with a corporate operative." She slid a photograph across the desk. It wasn't an Instagram shot of Madison in yoga pants. It was a high-resolution image of Madison sitting in a corner booth at a dark bar with the chief executive officer of Lone Star Hotels, our biggest competitor. The shark that had been trying to swallow Michael's hospitality. "Madison Sawyer isn't a marketing assistant," Elizabeth continued. "She's a specialized plant. Lone Star hired her to find Michael's ego and use it as a crowbar." I didn't feel the sting of a wife's betrayal. That bridge had burned years ago. I felt the sharp, cold satisfaction of an architect looking at a structural failure I hadn't designed, but was happy to witness. Michael thought he was the titan of Dallas hospitality. He thought he was so irresistible that a 26-year-old marketing genius just happened to fall for his midlife crisis. But Madison's job wasn't to love him. It was to ruin him. She had been the one whispering about high-stakes cryptocurrency. She had been the one encouraging the secret lines of credit from predatory lenders. Every cent of that $3,800,000 debt was a calculated strike. She was leading him into a minefield while he thought they were walking toward a sunset. "And the best part?" Elizabeth asked, leaning back. "By signing that agreement and waiving the audit, Michael has officially neutralized Lone Star's risk. He took the debt away from the company's collective assets and made it his personal, sole responsibility. He didn't just sign for the hotels, Rachel. He signed for the executioner's bill." I looked at the photograph. Madison looked bored in it. Michael was just a project she was finishing. For 15 years, I had been the silent investor in Michael's life, but Madison was the auditor who had closed the books on him. The discovery was lethal. It removed any remaining path to redemption for the man who had called our son a burden. My husband was holding a $3,800,000 bomb, and he was currently celebrating because he liked the way the timer ticked. "Does he know?" I asked. "He thinks he's king of the world," Elizabeth said. "But he's just a line item on someone else's balance sheet now." I realized then that Michael's ego was his greatest liability. He was so blinded by the spotlight he'd stolen from me that he couldn't see the shadows closing in. This wasn't a divorce. It was a corporate liquidation. And for the first time in 3 long years, I felt the air in the room turn light. The architect was free. The empire of dust belonged entirely to him. His lawyer leaned in and whispered 5 words. Just 5. "You are personally liable for everything." And Michael's face, that smug, self-satisfied face I'd stared at across the breakfast table for 15 years, went completely white. His hands started trembling. The papers he'd been so eager to sign were shaking like leaves in a storm. And me, for the first time in 3 years, I smiled. I wasn't just happy. I was vindicated. The air in the Dallas courtroom felt clinical, heavy with the scent of old wood and the sudden, sharp stench of Michael's fading arrogance. Judge Holden looked down at the documents Michael had just signed with such aggressive confidence. She didn't look like a protector of a broken marriage. She looked like a judge overseeing a corporate liquidation. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, "I am looking at the liability disclosure statement you voluntarily accepted. You have officially assumed sole responsibility for $3,800,000 in combined debt." Michael stood up abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. "This is fake. She manipulated the numbers. This is fraud." He pointed at me, his eyes wide with a terror I had been waiting 3 years to see. Elizabeth didn't even stand up. She simply tapped the waiver Michael had signed, the one where he explicitly refused an independent audit. "My client disclosed every line item, Michael. You chose to ignore the fine print because you were too busy admiring the spotlight." Watching Michael in that moment was like watching an architect realize his skyscraper was made of sand. Michael's power was never structural, it was a rental. He had spent 15 years performing as a titan, never realizing that his authority was a facade. Status is an illusion when it is funded by debt, and Michael had just signed the bill for his own funeral. His position in Dallas society was just a layer of paint over a hollow interior, and now the paint was peeling. He had the assets, but he didn't have the internal value to stand without them. Madison Sawyer didn't wait for the judge to finish. I watched her from the corner of my eye. She didn't offer a hand to Michael. She didn't offer comfort. She simply stood up, adjusted the cashmere coat she had stolen from my closet, and walked toward the exit without a single backward glance. To an operative like Madison, Michael was no longer a target. He was a liability that had been successfully liquidated. Michael screamed. He looked at his mother, Sarah, who sat in the gallery with a face that had aged a decade in 60 seconds. Then he looked at me. He expected me to be small. He expected me to be the sensible wife who would step in and fix the mess. "You said you wanted everything, Michael," I said, my voice steady and factual. "I simply gave you exactly what you asked for." I picked up my purse and took Jacob's hand. We walked past Michael as he stood in the wreckage of his own greed. He wasn't a titan anymore. He was just a man holding a 19-page bill he couldn't pay. As the courtroom doors closed behind us, I realized this wasn't revenge. It was accounting. And the ledger was finally clean. I heard Michael is living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Dallas now. No luxury watches, no Armani suits, just 19 pages of debt that will take him a lifetime to even understand. Madison Sawyer didn't stick around to help him pack. Lone Star Hotels fired her the same week the court proceedings ended. She was a specialized tool, and once Michael was ruined, she was simply an expense they were no longer willing to carry. My grandmother's $750,000 inheritance remained untouched throughout the war. Michael never found it because he never looked past the assets he could steal from me. I used that money to open my own architectural firm, and I called it the Sower. Not because I wanted to rebuild Michael's empire, but because I wanted to create a space that actually had a foundation. This is the justice of the Sower. While Michael spent 15 years consuming everything I built, I am spending my future building something that Michael can never touch. Real value. My son, Jacob, stands in my new office and looks at the Dallas skyline, and for the first time, he doesn't see a father's performance. He sees a mother's truth. He told me he's proud of me, and that is a currency that Michael can never borrow. I realized then that sometimes the best way to win is to let the other person have exactly what they want, especially when what they want is a house made of cards that are already on fire. The architect is finally free, and for the first time in longer than I can remember, the air feels clean. If you believe that character is the true currency of life, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of justice. Thank you for being a part of our community.